Hi, everybody. It's good to be here. Thank you for the invitation to come and to be part of this community. This is my first time to be part of this, so it seems like a really lovely, wonderful thing to do. I think doing theology in spaces like this is just such an exciting, great thing to do. Get outside of churches and kind of do it in public, right? So it's great. Just a bit more about me before I dive into kind of my topic, which, as you see, is sort of on theology and psychoanalysis. This is what I'm kind of speaking at today is kind of some of my current research interests. I'm sort of working at the beginning stages of a kind of book project on this theme. So you're sort of hearing my thoughts in motion, my thoughts as they're forming. So I've got no kind of grand conclusions for you, just like some good questions that I'm trying to ask myself. I'm also involved in, I just got back from the UK where I was there for a couple weeks. I'm part of a project at the University of Birmingham that's a research project on religion and psychology. They invited kind of people in religion and theologians to come over to learn a bit about psychology and to contribute to a research project on that. So I'm part of that project as well, and this kind of speaks out of that space as well. Psychoanalysis. So really, I mean, one way to get into it is to oversimplify, to kind of break it into two different ways of approaching it. There's a whole kind of clinical dimension of psychoanalysis. People who go to see a psychoanalyst, people who go into psychoanalytically informed psychotherapy, and there's an entire clinical dimension of this. I'm very interested in this dimension. I've had extensive experience in this dimension, not as a practitioner, but as a patient/client of it. And that's a kind of whole world unto itself. I'm not going to be so much talking about that dimension of psychoanalysis tonight, although I'm very interested in that. If people have questions about that kind of clinical side and what are the therapeutic presuppositions and aims of psychoanalysis, I'm very happy to talk about those. There's a kind of whole other side of psychoanalysis, which is about kind of just the human being, right? Kind of asking fundamental questions about what does it mean to be human, and what is human culture, and what are the kind of psychological dimensions of human life, human culture, human relationships. So Sigmund Freud, who's often cited as the founder of this kind of whole strange way of thinking, of course he himself was a clinician and did a lot of writing about the clinical space, but then he had lots of other writings that were what are sometimes called his more cultural writings, right? He wrote several books, at least 3 directly on religion, and tried to ask this question, what's going on in religion? And he wrote about culture in general. And that's that kind of side of psychoanalysis is where it kind of bumps up most against philosophy and theology. So it's that kind of area that I'm sort of interested in, and that I want to talk a bit about tonight, and about kind of how psychoanalysis from that side approaches the whole phenomenon of religion, and how it interprets it. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. I'm going to begin by giving you a quote from a Facebook post I came across recently. So it was a Facebook post. I'm not friends with this person, but a number of people shared this post. So it was by this fellow named Jim Palmer. Palmer, I think is his name. I think he's someone in America who runs a kind of spiritual but not religious. Maybe I'm seeing faces that maybe some of you know who this person is. A number of my friends on my feed shared this post, and it was kind of his, this fellow used to be a kind of evangelical megachurch pastor. He's, since moved out of that world and, kind of moved out of institutionalized religion. And this was a kind of list of 14 things, and I think he said something that the religious institutions don't really want you to know about religion. And he listed these kind of 14 things. And some of my friends shared it, and this is a great list, and blah, blah, blah. So one of the, number 6, I'm going to read you number 6 of his things that the religious institutions, the religionists don't want you to know. And this is number 6. I'm going to start there. I'm going to read this, and I'm going to return to this at the end and read it again. And I'm interested in what you make of it, because it's a kind of will get us into what we're talking about. All right, this is what Jim Palmer said. Anything you claim to know about God, even the notion that there is a God, is a projection of your psyche. What you say about God, who God is, what God cares about, who God rewards, and who God punishes, says nothing about God and everything about you. If you believe in an unconditionally loving God, you probably value unconditional love. If you believe in a God who divides people into chosen and not chosen, believers and infidels, saved and damned, high caste or low caste, etc., you're likely someone who divides people into groups, in-groups and out-groups, and you and your in-group as the quintessential in-group. God may or may not exist, but your idea of God mirrors yourself and your values. Okay, wow, we got some applause there. So, yes, so I'll just start there. I'll just throw that out, let that sit. Interested, what you make of it, whether you kind of viscerally agree with that, viscerally disagree with that, or maybe you're somewhere, I don't know what I think about that. Well, that's cool. Just think about it. All right. This way of thinking, right, that God is a projection of your psyche, right, of the psyche in some sense, right? It's not a new idea. It's been around for quite a while. And it goes at least as far back as a fellow in the 19th century named Ludwig Feuerbach. Has anyone come across this guy, Feuerbach? Maybe some of you? Yeah, all right, Feuerbach, right? So Feuerbach was a 19th century German anthropologist, very interested in studying religion, also interested in theology. And Feuerbach kind of came to the conclusion, kind of the sort of trope or tagline that gets associated with Feuerbach, is that theology is anthropology. This is Feuerbach's line, right? That theology, talk about God, is anthropology, meaning that everything what we really say about God is simply a way of talking about ourselves, about what we value, about our highest values, what we kind of want to idealize, what we want to strive for, which all gets gathered up in our kind of concepts of God, right? The things we value the most, the things that we believe in the most, the things we want to see in the world the most, our greatest hopes, fears, passions, everything that are in us, we kind of collect those, gather them together, and they become God, right? So Feuerbach theology is anthropology. So again, this sense that theologians that think maybe that when they're talking about God, they're talking about some real kind of object or person out there, but that's not true. What religion is and what theology is a kind of projection outward of our highest ideals, right? And that's Feuerbach's position, and so Feuerbach lived from 1804 to 1872, right? So this kind of position has been around at least since then. But it's one of the kind of fundamental modern critiques of religion. That emerges around early 19th century. I mean, has precedents before that, but really kind of gets going around this time. And three people really in particular pick up on this. Three people that the philosopher Paul Ricoeur gave the name Masters of Suspicion. Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud, right? The so-called Masters of Suspicion. They all read Feuerbach, and they all thought, oh yeah, I think Feuerbach's probably right about religion, right? That religion is a fundamentally anthropological phenomenon, that it's taking kind of human psychic dynamics, human passions, and packaging them up and projecting them onto the universe, or projecting them onto a kind of divine screen or something like this. So that's been around at least since Feuerbach. One of Feuerbach's famous lines is the following. God did not, as the Bible says, make man in his image. On the contrary, as I've shown in one of his famous books is called The Essence of Christianity. On the contrary, as I've shown, man made God in his image, right? God did not make us in God's image. We made God in our image and continue to make God in our image all the time, right? This is Feuerbach's position. All right. So just bracket that. Let me turn now to Freud. Usually people have heard the name Sigmund Freud in some way or another. I assume that's, probably more than Feuerbach. People are kind of vaguely familiar with Freud. He's got more cultural currency. Pardon? Oh, Fraser. Oh, yes, of course. Fraser, yes. There you go. That's right. Niles, right. He's a good Freudian. Okay, that's right. I haven't thought about that in a long time. Okay. Let me just give you just a kind of basic, kind of some high point introductions about Freud, and then narrow in on what he says about religion, right? And we'll get to that. So one way to kind of just sum up what made and what makes Freud is such an important figure is what you might call his the center of kind of psychoanalytic theory that Freud postulated, which is the unconscious, right? That human beings have this strange thing called the unconscious. that our mental life, our psychic life, of course, has a conscious dimension, right? We're all here, we sort of are conscious of ourselves to some degree. But Freud postulated this whole notion of that actually kind of deeper within psychic life and fundamental to it is this thing called the unconscious. There's a whole unconscious dimension of psychic life that in a way is its fundamental layer and fundamental dimension. Now, Freud himself put himself in a lineage of thinkers that he says made Copernican like revolutions and breakthroughs in human thinking. So the first of these is of course Copernicus. That's where the name comes from, Copernican. So what is I'll just throw it out. What is Copernicus known for? What did Copernicus do? Something to do with the sun. There you go. We're not the center of the universe, right? The fancy names for it, he moved us from, and again, there's precedents before this, he moved us from a geocentric model of the solar system to a heliocentric model, right? The Earth is not the center of things, the sun is the center, right? The Earth revolves around the sun does not revolve around the Earth like most ancient peoples thought. So Copernicus decentered the Earth, right? Decentered the Earth. The next kind of Copernican figure that Freud talks about is Darwin. Now, what's Darwin famous for? Yes, origin of species, theory of evolution, right? So for Freud, this is a kind of another blow to what he calls a blow to human narcissism. Copernicus dealt a fundamental blow to human narcissism because he decentered the Earth from the center of things, right? We thought we were the center of things. Nope, we're actually not. And really, physics has continued to kind of decenter us more and more and more and more and more as it's discovered more about the universe. Darwin decentered us from kind of biological history. That the human being didn't just plunk down, as the kind of grand thing. We are the product of a very long and very messy evolutionary history. So we're sort of decentered and we're fundamentally connected to all of biological history. So we're fundamentally decentered from our kind of special, unique place in biological history because of evolution. And then Freud says the kind of person, the next person who's come along to make this kind of Copernican blow to human narcissism is himself, right? And he does this by discovering the unconscious, right? Okay, if we're not the center of the universe, if we're not the center of biological history, surely we're the center of ourselves? Can we be the center of ourselves? Can I be the center of my own private psychic life? Freud says no. You're not the center of your own psychic life, right? There's this dimension called the unconscious. So Freud says we're not the master in our own homes. That's one of his lines. So Freud got to this discovery. Probably the main book that kind of is the beginning of psychoanalysis proper is his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. So he'd written lots of things before that, studies on hysteria, had analyzed various kind of patients, had various theory. But a lot of people point to kind of the interpretation of dreams as the first. So Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious because in dreaming, this whole other dimension of ourselves somehow takes over, right? Our kind of conscious waking psychic life goes to sleep and this whole other part of ourselves can kind of show itself. So Freud was interested in dreams. Freud was very interested in sexuality, interested in where it comes from. Freud famously, infamously posited that the existence of what he called infantile sexuality, that sexuality doesn't just emerge kind of after puberty in adult form, that infants and children are sexual in their own ways. And he wrote a lot about this. It's one of the most interesting and controversial. Another one of central Freudian theories is kind of the Oedipus complex. Maybe some of you, this is another thing, this idea that that how children develop is by kind of attaching to the mother and deeply desiring the mother, but then the father has to come along as a rival to the mother, and so the child has to navigate this conflict between being closely united to the mother, but the mother has other love objects besides the child, and the child is caught in this kind of parental love triangle, right? So the earliest kind of the child's earliest love objects happen within the context of the family. And that psychic development has to kind of go through this really kind of awful, confusing, conflicted phase of navigating through familial life. And that going through these conflicts kind of sets the template for later psychic life. How we relate to our earliest love objects, which is usually our parents, sets the templates and kind of on a fundamental, deep level inscribes in us the patterns of desire, the patterns of attachment that we carry with us into adult life. So, Oedipus complex. So Freud's general view of psychic life is that it's fraught with conflict, ambivalence, and he calls the management of drives. I was very happy that you used the language of drive when we have this drive to know, right? This drive to, which is very Freudian psychoanalytic language, right? That the human self is kind of beset by these drives that we can never fully master, right? That come from a part of ourselves deeper than our conscious knowing life, and that this essentially just makes being a human being really difficult, which I think is, we all know, right? Being a human being is not an easy thing. It's very difficult. And for Freud, this is because of postulates that we have these drives, right? All right. That we often, a sexual drive, a death drive. He posits a number of these drives. He theorizes them differently throughout his life. All right. That's the kind of high points of Freud in general. Let me move to religion. Freud was a huge critic of religion. That's the sum of it, right? He himself is Jewish, comes from a Jewish background. He is not what you would say was not a practicing Jew, and was sort of an avowed, atheist his whole life, even though he claims his Jewishness, and his Jewishness is a very important part of who he is. But he wouldn't call himself a Jew in a religious sense. Now, there's a whole body of literature out there, scholarly literature on Freud's Jewishness, and whether there's something fundamentally Jewish or religious or even theological about psychoanalysis that you can. So that's a very whole interesting question. But in general, Freud was a very a critic of religion, and his view of religion is basically that religion is an attempt to resolve unconscious needs and wishes. That this is what's happening in religion, right? We've got these unconscious conflicts, needs, wishes that we get from how we develop as very vulnerable children, going through this very complex, messy, awful process of growing up, and that we have these unconscious needs and wishes that we still have to work out in adult life. And for Freud, religion is one place where we stage these, where we stage them to work on them. So he calls religion a collective neurosis, right? This is one of his phrases, right? Religion is a collective neurosis. And in particular, it's neurosis because it stages the ongoing childish and emotional needs of conflicts living on in adult life, right? We've got these conflicts and these drives that come from our kind of infant, childhood, adolescent life, and they're unresolved. They remain unresolved, and religion is one attempt to collectively stage a way of managing and resolving some of these conflicts. So let me just quote one passage of his from his book Totem and Taboo, where he basically says God is a projected father figure, right? That all of us have daddy issues from growing up, and religion is one place where we attempt to work on them. The psychoanalysis of human beings, Freud says, teaches us with quite special insistence that the God of each of them, those patients that he was analyzing, the God of each of them is formed in the likeness of his father. That his personal relation to God depends on his relationship to his father in the flesh and oscillates and changes along with that relation, and that at bottom, God is nothing other than an exalted father, right? So there you go, right? Jim Palmer in Facebook post is saying nothing new. Freud said it, Feuerbach said it before him, right? In the future of an illusion, right? This is another of Freud's books on religion, right? And you can catch his attitude towards religion just by the title there. The future of an illusion, right? It's an illusion. That he thinks that religion is not what he says a precipitate of experience or the end result of thinking. They're illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of humankind. The secret lies in their strength of those wishes. So again, religion is basically a kind of projection, and that God for Freud, again, one way to sum it up is that because life is so conflicted, because life is so difficult, because being a mortal, conscious human being in this life is actually terrifying, for Freud thinks that religion is essentially an attempt to kind of posit a parent figure out there who continues to take care of us as if we were children when we're adults. Because when we're adults, we kind of leave home, and yet we still have these fundamental conflicts, we still have these fundamental vulnerabilities and fears of being human, of being finite mortal creatures. And so religion is one way, okay, we no longer have mom and dad around, we have to put a kind of cosmic parent out there who can assure us that we will be taken care of, that life isn't ultimately meaningless, and that we can pray to, and who is there to protect us, right? That's Freud's essential view of religion, right? It's there to compensate for sort of fundamental needs and conflicts. Now, there's a whole complex way in which Freud thinks religion also stages the ongoing kind of Oedipal conflicts that characterize human life. I won't go into those details, although they're really interesting. All right. Later, Freud kind of comes around and says, all right, he still doesn't like religion, but he kind of recognizes, the late Freud, that there's a fundamental kind of place for it in human life. Early Freud thought, okay, that scientific progress will eventually just undo religion, right? We'll just eventually know enough to not need religion anymore. Later, Freud says, actually, religion plays this kind of fundamental role in forming us as societies and social bonds. That we need the kind of rules, regulations that religion provides in order to actually just cohere as human societies. Otherwise, we just murder each other, and we'd all be sort of given over to these kind of completely narcissistic and selfish drives. And there has to be some kind of check on that for us to actually form social communities. Religion sort of plays this part of this role. All right, that's Freud. Not a very positive, take on religion. Let me now turn to a different account. It's still a psychoanalytic account. It's not an attempt to rescue religion in the way that Freud has, from Freud's critique, but it's an attempt to think a bit more deeply about it in a bit more nuanced way. So this line of psychoanalytic thinking is associated with a few French, the names I'll put it to are a few French names. So there's a French psychoanalytic theorist named Jacques Lacan. There's another one named Jean Laplanche, and then there's another one named Julia Kristeva. These are some of the names that are associated with this more kind of French interpretation of the psychoanalytic tradition, and particularly its connection with religion, or how it interprets religion, or what it thinks religion is. The basic claim of this orientation, so first I'll just kind of say its basic principle, and then how we might rethink religion from it. This wants to think within a Freudian psychoanalytic tradition, but it critiques Freud, in particular his vision of human life as kind of, driven by what Freud called these drives, right? Or at least how Freud conceptualized what the drives are. Freud thought these drives that drive us all, right, are fundamentally kind of biological and innate, right? We're kind of born with them in a way. They're the way in which the human organism expresses itself as it grows, right? They're kind of biological instincts. The death drive, the sex drive, the eros drive, any of these others. They're kind of innate in the human being, and they kind of unfold from within the human being. This other tradition of psychoanalysis wants to critique Freud along these lines and say that what Freud didn't quite get, he shows hints of trying to think this and understand this, but he kind of turns away from it and doesn't follow through on thinking it and goes down this kind of biological line, is what this other school tries to pick up on is the fundamental importance of other people, right? This is the idea in its nutshell, that the human psychic structure, human mental life, human emotional life does not just develop on its own. It does not unfold according to a kind of innate biological template, right? As if, if a flower blooms, it's because it's, the seed, and it just kind of grows, and it's got all of its coding there in the seed, and it just needs a bit of input, and it kind of is what it is. Human life doesn't unfold like this. Human life is more radically, fundamentally dependent upon other people than Freud gave it credit for. And that the very possibility of developing as a human being is because we are in relationship to and depend on other people. So one of the thinkers that I named Jean Laplanche, he calls this the fundamental anthropological situation. And for him, the fundamental anthropological situation, it's his way of naming kind of something that is universal about human life. There's not many things that we can say are universal about human life, because human life is shot through with so much radical difference and differentiation. But if there's one thing that we can say is universal about human life, it's that we were all born as helpless infants. All right, this is where Laplanche starts. We're all born as helpless infants and are fundamentally dependent upon other people for our development and care. And so this he calls the fundamental anthropological situation that we are born helpless into this world and that we all have adult caregivers. And furthermore, therefore, that the story of human development, how psychic, emotional life develops, is always because a helpless child, infant, is born into and taken care of by an adult world. That's the kind of fundamental situation. And part of that situation is a radical asymmetry. That this helpless infant who doesn't have speech, who doesn't have language, is kind of confronted with and even bombarded by an adult world that it strives to make sense of, that it has to make sense of. In order to survive, right? It has to attach to mother or adult caregiver. But there's a fundamental asymmetry. So the infant is all the time being surrounded by an adult world that's full of messages, that's full of language, that's full of gestures, that's full of sights and sounds and smells and things, and it's all the time overwhelming to it. And it's all the time trying to find its way in this world. And it develops as it learns how to translate bits of the world and make sense of the world. But there's a lot of this world that it doesn't understand, that it's overwhelming to it. And Laplanche uses the phrase enigmatic. That's enigmatic to the child. That's enigmatic to the infant. And for Laplanche, this relationship between a helpless child and an adult world, this is the source of the unconscious. The unconscious is not a kind of biologically based drive thing. It's because as children grow up in an adult world, they are surrounded by more than they can integrate, more than they can digest, and yet all of this kind of lands on them. And so, and in particular within the family, with messages that the child receives from adult caregivers, and that the child can make sense of some of this and learns to make sense of some of this and enters into a meaningful world by translating some of it. But there's a whole other dimension, what he calls the kind of enigmatic dimension, enigmatic messages, that kind of land in the child, land in the infant, that they can't process, that they don't know what to do with. But that forms their psychic structure around the things they know and then the things they don't know. And for Laplanche, and for Lacan as well, this is the source of the unconscious. The reason that we have this unconscious part of ourselves that drives us in various ways is not because it's simply a feature of our biological lives, but because it's formed in the very interaction of a child and the adult world. That's the basic idea. So, what this means then is that the child's psychic life, it starts to make some divisions in order to survive and cope in this world. It makes some divisions between things that it can kind of safely recognize and that make sense to it. But then there's this whole other dimension that, again, these thinkers want to recognize that comes to the child and that forms us in a very primal and fundamental way. A whole dimension of the adult world, and in particular the adult caregivers that we're close to, that's unknown, that's unnerving, that's anxiety-provoking, and that's overwhelming. And that this kind of dimension of being a child, growing up in this world, this is the kind of resides in the unconscious, and the child kind of makes some splits between the world that it kind of knows and the world that it doesn't know. And so the child is always having to negotiate this kind of relationship between the known and the unknown, and that's a fundamental feature of human life. So in particular, this, and again, what I'm trying to get at here for these thinkers is that the source of that there's this sort of, that there's an enigmatic, unnerving, unknown dimension that's part of our normal, everyday interactions, that begins in childhood and that continues into adult life. This dimension of each other that presents something unknown, that's both slightly unnerving, anxiety-provoking, but also alluring, right? It's also enticing. So Laplanche, again, also uses the language of seduction, that there's something seductive about the adult world, even as there's something overwhelming about it. So again, it's that, and that this is not this is a feature of everyday social life, and that this is something that we carry into everyday social life, is this way of managing this sort of unknown dimension of human. So let me just give you a few examples to maybe to get a sense of this. Again, one of the, if we just think about everyday interactions in social life, one of the kind of universal taboos that probably most of us are familiar with and would agree with, is that kind of prolonged, unguarded eye contact is uncomfortable, right? Is sort of you don't do that, right? When you're talking with someone, you don't just stare eye to eye contact. Now, why? What's going on there? There's that little thing points to the fact that even in our, like a room like this, we're all friends, we're all, there's something unnerving about all of us, right? We're still guarded, right? There's something enigmatic, there's something overwhelming, there's something unknown about every one of us, even in our day-to-day interactions, right? And that the fact that we that we have to look away from each other is a way of, and in part because being exposed to eye contact is in a prolonged way, is in an unbearable sense being exposed to the unknown intentions and desires of the other person. What does that other person want? Who are they? How are they positioning themselves? And so we have to sort of look away in order to bear the social anxiety of the unknown in ourselves and in others that we all bear. That's an example. Another example, the tendency to reduce most day-to-day interactions to empty small talk, right? Again, this is just a common feature of social life, right? When we're talking to each other, we very easily just slip into contact as a way of managing the fundamental anxiety of being around other human beings, right? We'll talk about the weather, we'll talk about, whatever, the Matildas winning last night, which is awesome, by the way, but human small talk. Different, and another example, different cultures do this differently. One feature of our kind of technological culture is our digitally mediated relationships. Digitally mediated relationships are a way of managing social anxiety. They're a way of kind of keeping ourselves at a distance and connected at the same time. This is what digitally mediated relationships do. Another kind of fundamental anthropological, just think about clothing, how clothing functions, and all the taboos and kind of regulations that clothing puts around sexuality, nakedness, desire, how clothes function. Clothes kind of hide us from each other, but they also announce the very things that they hide at the same time, right? And there's a fundamental ambivalence about that. All right. Now, religion. These psychoanalytic thinkers want to say that the kind of fundamental religious impulse comes, again, not simply from Freud's, that we just want a parent in the sky, although these thinkers say that sometimes that definitely is operative in religion, but that this whole kind of enigmatic, unnerving realm of our day-to-day lives, of our interactions with each other, that religion is one place where this dimension, this social dimension of being human, again, is staged and enacted and something's done with it. That's the kind of, which is different from Freud, where it's simply a projection of our kind of childish, wish fulfillments. This understanding of religion is that this fundamentally enigmatic relationship to each other that is operative all the time in our social life. Religion is one place where we stage that, where we, again, give different forms to it. Sometimes those forms are defensive forms where we need to kind of manage it, and sometimes those forms are where we can actually open up to it. From this perspective, one way to talk about religion is that religions are various systems. They're made up of rituals, they're made up of texts, they're made up of moral codes that place us in relation to this unknown dimension of personal existence. This is what religions do with other human beings. This kind of enigmatic, unknown dimension of relations to other human beings, religion in various ways places us to us. The very word religion comes from the Latin. It means to bind, right? To tie or to bind. So religion, through its rituals, through its texts, is one way of tying us or binding us or putting us in relation to, and again, from this perspective, this fundamentally enigmatic, unknown dimension of the human existence that we then give various names to. And we regard as sacred, but sacred both as anxiety-provoking and alluring at the same time, and religion is one way in which this is put into play. So again, it's a talk about religion. Again, this is still very much in a kind of Feuerbachian Freudian line, but it's trying to think more expansively about it, a bit more nuanced way about what's actually going on in various religions. So religions, again, formalize a relation to this enigmatic dimension of human existence. Sometimes repressing it, sometimes managing it, sometimes trying to control it, sometimes trying to put very strict moral regulations in place as a way of managing it, and sometimes letting the enigmatic and the unknown unsettle, letting it reorganize social life in interesting ways. 3 examples of this. So I'm following here a scholar named Richard Boothby. His book, Embracing the Void, Rethinking the Origin of the Sacred. It's a really great book on psychoanalysis and religion. And he offers various interpretations of various religious traditions through this lens. So Greek kind of polytheistic religion, Judaism, Christianity, and then he discusses a few more, and he ends by talking about capitalism as a religion. In short, for Greek religions, essentially, how they kind of encode this enigmatic dimension of social existence and turn it into a kind of religious system, is that Greek religion essentially worships something like force or fate. And that this is in the form of the different gods and their mythologies, also in the form of Greek tragedy. This sense that there's something enigmatic, there's something unknowable about human existence, and the Greeks called it fate, right? That life is not fundamentally under our control, that there's something, and that tragedy can happen, and that Greek religion is organized kind of around this relation to the enigmatic, giving it this form. And the Greek hero has a place in relation to this kind of tragic, enigmatic dimension of existence. Again, we could unpack all these forever, but I'm just kind of flying through them, and I'm almost done. Judaism, for Boothby, Judaism is a religion of the incompleteness and unknownness of language and naming itself. So again, Judaism is a religion of the covenant, Yahweh's covenant with Israel, and that covenant comes through the giving of law, it comes through the giving of language, but there's something fundamentally, again, enigmatic, incomplete about this relationship. And God, for Boothby, God is a name for that enigmatic, unfinished dimension of life itself and of language itself. So again, if you think of one of the fundamental scenes in the Hebrew Bible, Moses' encounter with the burning bush, right? God presents in this very enigmatic form. Moses says, who do I tell Pharaoh is sending me to go free the people from Egypt? And instead of giving Moses a name, what does God say? I am who I am, right? Or I will be who I will be, however you want to translate that. Which again is a kind of refusal to give a name, right? It's a refusal to answer, right? It maintains God's own enigma, God's own kind of confronting, alluring, but anxiety, unnerving, provoking relationship. God kind of becomes the name for that and is the symbol of that, and then functions as the very incompleteness of the covenant itself. So again, one of the features of Judaism as a religion is it's characterized by a kind of endless debate and interpretation of the Torah that can never come to an end. And this is one of the features of Jewish commentaries on its scriptures, is that there's no final answer anywhere, right? Like Judaism is structured around the incompleteness of its own, of God's giving of the law and what that means for how we ought to live it. It's kind of structured by that. This is how Boothby puts it. He says, for the Jewish community, open-hearted debate, informed by the scriptural tradition, yet still uncertain of its precise meaning, is in itself the posture of true devotion. Judaism is the religion of perpetual worry over the law and its meaning. To be Jewish, one is tempted to say, is to endlessly disagree with one's fellow Jews about what it means to be Jewish, and to fully tolerate the consequences of that disagreement. Right? So again, it's and that God in this way of interpreting it is that which preserves the incompleteness that occasions the ongoing debate, right? That God is fundamentally unknowable, unnameable in some sense, even as God is covenanted with us, right? God holds that incomplete, enigmatic dimension of the social life gathered around Jewish kind of texts and rituals open. Christianity. So if Greek religion is the worship of fate, if Judaism is in a way the kind of worship of God, the God the lawgiver, and God is the incompleteness and impossibility of naming itself, Christianity God is love, right? And Christianity is structured as the worship, you might say, the worship of love. So, again, from Boothby's perspective, what is one fascinating about Christianity is one that we have a human God, an incarnate God who dies, an incarnate God who dies a terrible, horrible death. There's a whole interesting thing going on there, and Boothby offers very interesting psychoanalytic kind of readings of what's going on in Christianity. But the thing he dwells most on, and I find fascinating, is this, the kind of what he wants to highlight is the kind of heart of Christianity is Jesus' command to love your neighbor as yourself. And as a kind of gloss on that, and you should love your enemy as well. Love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy. And how Boothby interprets this from a psychoanalytic lens is that what happens in Christianity is that God comes to name not simply a kind of transcendent object out there, but God as the possibility of love between people. And that God is the love between people. But what that love means is fundamentally not that we simply like each other, right? Because we reflect ourselves back to each other. You know, that we all speak the same language, so we like each other. You know, we all like the same things, we all vote for the same people, we all go for the same sports teams, we all are part of the same religion, and therefore we can love each other. Jesus' command to love the neighbor and love the enemy kind of actually goes way beyond that. And the way that Boothby interprets it is that Jesus' command to love the neighbor is to open yourself to the enigmatic, unnerving dimension of the neighbor that you would rather not deal with. In other words, open yourself to the unconscious dimension of the neighbor, that part of the neighbor that is overwhelming, unknown to you, potentially threatening to you. Open yourself to that dimension of the neighbor and form a relationship with them there. And for Boothby, that also means that you have to get to know that part of yourself as well. You have to be willing to confront the unknown, unnerving, kind of anxiety-provoking, enigmatic nature of yourself in order to then be open to the unknown, enigmatic nature of the other. And that dynamic in which love isn't simply about a kind of tribalistic, enclosure around people who like the same things or people who identify with each other or identify around the same kind of big symbolic things. But loving the neighbor just insofar as I don't know them and I can't fit them into my world, I can't fit them in, that's what Christianity is fundamentally about, which is opening to this whole unconscious enigmatic dimension. So God becomes the possibility of a different kind of social bond in which we love each other precisely according to all of our idiosyncratic quirks, the way in which we annoy each other, the way in which we threaten each other, the way in which, again, those outside of our groups appear alien, threatening, evil. The call of that kind of love is to, and you shall love them too. Not because they're like you, but you shall love them precisely according to their enigmatic, unconscious dimension, right? And that's how Boothby, and that's kind of what Christianity interpreted through this kind of psychoanalytic lens is. All right, I'm going to stop there because I think that's enough to chew on. Let me go back. As I said, let me go back, and I'm going to read this quote again, and maybe you feel the same way about it, maybe you don't, which is fine, right? There's no prescription here. Anything you claim to know about God, even the notion that there is a God, is a projection of your psyche. What you say about God, who God is, what God cares about, who God rewards, and who God punishes, says nothing about God and everything about you. If you believe in an unconditionally loving God, you probably value unconditional love. If you believe in a God who divides people into chosen and not chosen, believers and infidels, saved and damned, high caste or low caste, etc., you're likely someone who divides people into in-groups and out-groups, with you and your group as the quintessential in-group. God may or may not exist, but your idea of God mirrors yourself and your values. So I'll just leave that there. Now, I don't think that's unproblematic in certain kind of ways, but I will leave it with you. All right.